I turned 62 the day my son threw me out of the house I built. He didn't yell. He just placed a ring of rusted keys on the marble counter and said, "Dad left you the garage, Mom. That's all you're worth." The rain outside hit harder than his words, but not by much. Movers wrapped my furniture while my wedding portrait faced the wall. I walked out without a coat, without a goodbye, just those keys biting into my palm like proof I still existed. Now I stood in front of that forgotten garage, my breath fogging in the cold. The lock turned too smoothly, as if someone had been waiting for me. When the door lifted, the darkness breathed back, and in the beam of my flashlight I saw something that made my heart stop. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I stood under the dim street lamp and let my breath settle. The air tasted like iron and old rubber. A chain-link fence rattled somewhere down the alley. The door in front of me was corrugated steel, painted a tired blue. I pressed the key against my palm until it left a small crescent. The habit of a lifetime tried to pull me back into politeness and explanations. It was the habit that made me set extra plates at holidays because my son might drop by, that made me speak softly when other people spoke sharply, that made me apologize for occupying space. The habit held on for one more moment, then let go. I fit the key into the padlock. I expected resistance and a scream of metal. The lock turned like a throat clearing itself. Smooth. Oiled. Looked neglected from the street, but someone had been here. Someone had cared enough to keep this small piece of it alive. My hand stilled on the lock. Richard. Of course, I said it out loud as if saying his name could warm the air. I raised the door a foot, then two, then enough to step inside and pull it down behind me. The lights did not answer my first search along the wall. I took out the small flashlight from my tote, the one I kept since his last hospital stay, when I learned that keeping light with me changed more than hallways. The beam slid over concrete and dust. It was quiet enough to hear my shoes on grit. In the narrow cone of light, I saw a workbench, not a junk heap, but a surface wiped clean. A folded shop towel lay in the middle, as if someone had planned to return after lunch and never did. To the left, 3 tall shapes under fitted covers pressed against the far wall. I let the beam skate over them and pass on. I did not lift anything. Not yet. I was not here to feed hysteria. I was here to breathe. The smell of solvent was faint and then stronger near the back corner where a utility sink stood. On the pegboard above it, a row of hooks waited for tools. Most of the hooks were empty. One held a coil of heavy tape. The order of the room calmed the part of me that had walked out of a home and into an accusation. Someone had left an intention behind. I set my tote on the workbench and counted to 5 the way I used to tell my students when they were about to rush a line in charcoal. The count and the hand will steady. I called him then. I do not know why. Habit again, maybe, or some small desire to hear him prove me wrong. He answered on the second ring. "I will send someone for the rest of your things," he said. "Do not stay there long." For a moment, I watched my breath in the narrow beam and did not respond. He filled the silence with efficiency. "There is no point drawing this out, Mom. The building needs work. The study is becoming my office. It is time." Under the tone, I heard something else. Triumph has a particular weight to it when it belongs to a child you raised for better things. I said I would manage. He said it was for the best. The call ended without a goodbye. I put the phone face down and let the room take the echoes. The flashlight beam found a switch and a metal box. When I lifted the panel, I saw new wiring, labels with neat block letters. Overhead fixtures blinked and came alive in a long wash of soft white. Not one bulb, but a grid of small modern lights recessed into the ceiling. The garage did not jump from ruin to palace, but it changed enough to make me straighten. The floor was sealed concrete, not stained with ancient spills, but mottled like stone. On the far right, there was a narrow door with a push bar. I tried it and found a tiny office tucked behind the wall. A narrow couch, a filing cabinet, a kettle on a hot plate, a box of tea bags still in date, a folded blanket still in plastic. In the top drawer of the desk, a small notebook waited. No name on it. I ran a palm over the cover and put it back unopened. Not yet. I returned to the main space and stood beneath the nearest overhead light. I let the brightness fall on my hands. They were steady now. I walked to the first of the covered shapes. My fingers found the edge of the fabric and then chose to step back. I had 40 years with Richard and still learned things after he left. I did not need to lift a single cover to know that. I turned instead and studied the wall near the door. That was when I saw it. A small envelope taped flat beside the switch at shoulder height. The tape was fresh. My name is written in his hand. The world narrowed to that square of paper. I reached up and stopped. Not yet. A lesson arrives when the mouth is closed. I walked away from it and circled the room once more. The room had its own weather. The air nearest the door felt thin. Near the office it was warmer. The far wall was cool enough to touch and leave a small oval of warmth behind. I opened the utility sink and let a thin stream run. Clean. I washed my hands and watched the water turn gray and then clear and then nothing but a thread of light. When I was certain my breathing did not claw at the chest anymore, I dried my hands on the folded towel and went back to the envelope. I held it up to the light as if something could be read through the fold. Nothing. I slid it into my tote. Later. I would not stand on a concrete floor under a humming grid and cry through his words. I wanted a chair, a room with still air, and a cup that could hold heat. I clicked off the lights and brought the door up enough to let the outside in. No longer a sheet of water. The alley gleamed dark and clean. I stepped out and pulled the door down through its track until it kissed the concrete. The padlock took the bar and clicked. I pocketed the key. The metal felt warm now in my palm. I stood with my back against the door and looked up at the slice of night above the alley. Somewhere between the buildings, a siren called to someone else. Life is going on in other rooms. I remember learning as a girl that leaving is its own kind of courage. I thought of Richard's laugh when he fixed something for a neighbor and told them that not everything needed replacing. Sometimes it only needed respect. He used to say that about people too. I walked to the corner and waited beneath the muted glow of a streetlight. A bus groaned past with a handful of faces leaning against the glass as if each one had chosen a different story for themselves and gotten lost in the middle. I took a cab and told the driver to head toward the river. He did not ask why. People who drive for a living know when not to ask. When we turned onto Oakwood, I asked him to let me out near the public library. A bench sat under a maple tree as if it had been put down for my small life to rest on. I sat and took out the envelope. I traced my name once. Twice. I put it back without opening it. Not from fear. From reverence. I wanted to meet whatever was inside with more than adrenaline and steam rising off a soaked coat. I wanted to meet it with the part of me that still listened for small bells in ordinary moments. My phone buzzed again. Caleb. I let it ring. He sent a message. He said the designer would need access to the study and that my boxes would be moved to Aunt Louise by morning. He added that I should send an address for the rest. Then a final line. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. I typed and erased. Typed and erased again. At last, I wrote that I have what I need and set the phone face down so the light would not chase me. Across the street, the library doors breathed people in and out. A woman came down the steps with a child who carried a book against his chest like it might escape. They passed under the light and turned the corner, and the night took them gently. I rose and walked back toward the main road. My shoes left small crescent marks on damp concrete, and then those marks dimmed, and then they were gone. In the corner of a dim cafe, I ordered tea and took a table near the window. The cup arrived, and I wrapped both hands around it. Heat can be a kind of truth when everything else feels like a test. I set the envelope on the table and thought of the lock turning without complaint. Thought of the shop towel folded in a perfect square and the way the grid of lights took the room without blinking. None of it was an accident. My husband knew how to leave plans where people only saw leftovers. I could almost hear him say it in that half-amused, careful tone that used to pull me back from the edge of panic. People love spectacle, Nora, he would say in my mind, but permanence is quiet. The tea cooled, and I finished it. I put the envelope back into my tote. I would sleep for a few hours, then return at first light. The space would tell me more when the day softened it. Outside the cafe, the street had shifted to that hour when the city belongs to people who close places and those who open them. I walked toward the small hotel 2 blocks down. The clerk gave me a room with a view of the river. In the mirror, I looked older than this morning and younger than I felt at noon. I laid my coat on the chair and the keys beside it. The clink of metal was smaller now, not the sound of a sentence, the sound of a beginning. I slept. When I woke, a thin band of pale color traced the edge of the curtain. The room hummed with the patience of early morning. I dressed and packed, and held the envelope again. Later. The word did not mean avoiding. It meant honoring what weighed to change me. I checked out and walked back to the alley. The city had that fresh chemical brightness of a place scrubbed overnight by people whose names I will never know. I reached the door, slid the key into the lock, and felt the smooth turn answer me like a practiced greeting. The door rose with the quiet strength of well-kept metal. Inside, the air met me like a room that had been listening for my return. I set my tote down and switched on the overheads. The light poured over everything and removed the last of the shadows. I stepped to the first covered shape. I held the edge of the fabric and let it fall again, still not ready to lift the past all at once. Patience, I told myself. Let the story come at the speed of trust. The key in my pocket felt warm and solid. I closed my fingers around it, and the small click of that motion folded into another sound rising in my head, the slow scratch of a pen across thick paper, and the careful breath people hold in a room where a will is being read. The clink of metal faded, the imagined ink grew louder, and I understood that before I lifted a single cover, I would need to tell you how the lawyer smiled and how a sentence on paper can change the weather inside a family. When the lawyer smiled, I knew mercy was not part of the paperwork. His mouth moved a fraction and then settled as if the expression had been practiced in a mirror for rooms like this. The office was too warm for late afternoon. A vent hummed above the window blinds. A glass carafe sat on a tray with 2 upside-down tumblers that no one touched. The table was walnut and reflected our hands in a soft blur, mine folded together. Caleb's spread wide, each finger claiming territory that was not yet his. Mr. Lowell was careful and tidy. He aligned the folder with the edge of the table, squared the corners of a stack of documents, and adjusted his silver pen so it lay straight along a legal pad. Everything about him said there would be no loose ends, not even the small ones that let oxygen into a difficult day. He glanced at me as if to measure the height of my silence, then cleared his throat and spoke to the room more than to the people in it. The phrasing he chose placed distance between us and the facts. The document declared. The statement was revealed. The record reflected. Each phrase arrived like a small metal clasp snapping shut. I watched his pen rather than his face. It caught the light and threw a thin line across the paper. Richard had owned such a pen. He used to polish it with the hem of his shirt, not for vanity but because he liked things that worked well and lasted. He would have noticed how Lowell balanced the cap on the table without letting it roll. He would have said the man had hands for surgery. The thought flickered and went out. Death taught me how quickly a room can become colder without changing the thermostat. Lowell read names and dates and the kind of numbers that are supposed to make a person feel secure. He did not speak my husband's name like a friend. He spoke it like a clerk at a counter where the line never ends. When he reached the part that mattered, his eyes flicked up to meet mine and then away. My husband's holdings flowed through the careful sentences. The condominium on the hill with its wide glass and winter light found a new owner. The primary investments and their rights and benefits found a new owner. The language did not stumble. It did not blush. It simply placed everything with my son. Caleb did not move. He did not need to. The change that ran through him was not visible like a ripple under the skin. It was a quiet tightening in his shoulders. It was the way his breath settled into a cadence that felt like victory, trying to be polite. Mr. Lowell kept reading. The part for me arrived in a single line that did not belong with the rest. To Nora Bennett, the statement revealed the bequest of Unit 11 storage garage and contents. There was a number and a street, and a key code. The line ended. The pen moved on. For a moment, the sound in the room became the hush of a church where someone has whispered a confession that cannot be undone. Then the hum of the vent returned, and the blinds shook a little when a truck idled outside. Caleb's thumbnail tapped a rhythm against the table edge. He said, "Mother, this is for the best." He said the property needs someone who will use it. He said I would not know what to do with investments anyway. He smiled as he said it, a soft curve meant to cushion the blow, and the curve became its own insult. I stared at the pen so I would not say the first words that rose to my tongue. Rage is a poor attorney. Silence listens better. Mr. Lowell slid a small envelope toward me. He said your husband was precise and that every word was intentional. He did not over-explain what intention meant. The envelope had a tag attached with my name in his careful, office hand. Inside was a key on a ring that did not clink as it moved. The felt pouch held the sound in place. The details stole something from panic. There are days when a felt pouch is mercy. This was not such a day. Caleb pressed his palm to my shoulder as if he were steadying me for a photograph. The touch was not cruel. It was worse than that. It was casual. He said he would take care of arranging the transfer of utilities and access codes and all the small errands that make ownership real. He said I could take time to sort my things. The words came smoothly and gently, like a nurse with a needle. I saw the boy he had been in the set of his jaw, the boy who once insisted on carrying 2 grocery bags to the car because he did not want help. I still remember that boy. I do not know where he went. Mr. Lowell continued with a paragraph on tax considerations and the timeline for filings. He turned pages with the same patience used to turn a calendar. At one point, he paused and looked at me to see if I wanted water. I said no with a shake of my head. If I tasted anything in that office, I would taste everything I had lost. Better to keep the mouth dry and the back straight, and let the words pass through like a storm that has already chosen its path. He asked if I had questions. I asked how long Richard had worked on this arrangement. Lowell said years with a careful wait that meant do not blame today for a plan made in an earlier season. He said your husband believed in clarity. He said safeguards help when emotions are loud. He kept his eyes on the page when he spoke, so I would not see if he agreed with the choices or merely respected them. Caleb leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table, an athletic pose that made him look younger. He asked about timelines. He asked about access. He asked what else might be in the inventory. Mr. Lowell answered with professional calm. Access would be immediate. Inventories would be furnished. Signatures needed to be placed in the designated fields, and then the proper authorities would be notified. The language was a corridor with many doors but no windows. I stood in it and felt how airless it could be. When it ended with the soft click of a pen cap. Mr. Lowell signed his name in 3 places, and then slid the documents to me and then to Caleb. I signed in the spaces he had flagged. The pen felt heavier than it looked. A weight tucked inside the barrel, perhaps a mechanism that made the ink flow smoother. I returned the pen, and when it left my hand, my fingers remembered the shape for a moment, the way skin remembers sun long after it is gone. Lowell gathered each paper and stacked them in a smooth packet. He placed a small brass clip over the top edge and closed the folder. The sound it made was not loud, but it was final. Caleb stood and offered to walk me to the elevator. I told him I would be fine. He said he had a meeting anyway and that we would talk tonight. He did not wait for me to answer. He was already in the hallway on the phone by the time I reached the door. I heard his voice flatten into business and then round back into charm. He had always been good at both. Mr. Lowell held the door for me. He said if there was anything I needed, I could call. I told him I would. I thanked him for his time. I used the polite words that live in the mouths of women who do not want to make a scene. When I reached the lobby, the receptionist looked up and then back at her screen. She had a glass paperweight on her desk with a pressed violet inside. The flower looked trapped in a pretty way that almost hid the fact that it could not breathe. Outside, the day had the sticky dimness of weather that cannot decide if it will break. I walked 2 blocks without knowing where my feet were going. I thought about the office's soft lights and the way the silver pen caught them. I imagined Richard in that chair months before, listening to the same careful verbs, nodding when asked to confirm a date, choosing which parts of his life to place where when he was no longer in the room to argue. I used to tease him that he loved systems more than people. He always answered that a good system gives people a fair chance to be good. The memory came and went. I did not know yet whether this system would do that, or whether it would burn what was left standing. At the corner, a bus sighed to a stop and let out a man carrying a potted fern. He shielded it with his jacket as if green mattered more than anything that could be sold. I admired him for 1 second. Then I turned and faced the city like a person who has misplaced a map and found a compass in her pocket. There are ways to lose and still be found. The thought did not comfort me. It steadied me enough to keep walking. By the time I reached the parking garage, the light had changed. The subterranean air smelled of brake dust and something sweet from a spill that had not been mopped well. My car was where I left it. I sat behind the wheel and let my hands rest at 10 and 2 like a student again. The envelope with the key lay on the passenger seat, a small thing with the power of a sentence. I placed my palm over it and felt the grit of paper against my skin. Then I started the engine and let the sound fill the space that words had emptied. I drove without turning on the radio. Noise from outside would have felt like a stranger in the back seat. I watched the way traffic changed shape with every light. I watched the faces around me and wondered how many of them were going home, and how many were driving to a place that used to be home. When I reached the block where the storage unit sat, a delivery truck was backing into a loading bay. A man in an orange vest lifted both hands to guide it, and for a second, the gesture looked like surrender. Then the truck settled, and he lowered his arms, and the world resumed its usual bargain with itself. I parked along the alley and stepped out. The door to Unit 11 waited, with its chipped blue paint and its promise of something I could not yet name. I listened to the city one breath longer. Somewhere, a siren softened and a dog barked twice and was silent. I set the envelope against the metal and slid the key from its pouch. It was smoother than it had any right to be, as if someone had traced it with cloth until it learned the language of my hand. It found the lock and turned. The pad clicked open with that neat office sound again, a tidy conclusion after a tidy decision, the same sound the pen cap had made on Lowell's desk. I lifted the door. The first inches gave with a sigh like paper. The next feet gave with a low, steady roll that swallowed the memory of signatures and replaced it with the breath of a room that had been waiting. The air inside smelled like metal and memory. It settled on my tongue the way an old hymn settles in a quiet church, familiar even if you have not sung it in years. I stood in the threshold and let the room make itself known without rushing to define it. There was a hush I had not noticed last night, a held breath between concrete and steel, as if the space had been listening for a footstep and finally got one. I moved the door to its first notch and bent to slide a wooden block under the track so it would not slam shut behind me. The light outside fell in a pale slice across the floor. It caught fine lines where a broom had passed long ago and left faint swirls of order on the surface. The overhead fixtures waited. I did not touch them. I wanted the room on its own terms first. The beam from my small flashlight stitched a path from one corner to the other. It made a soft white seam wherever it landed, and left the rest in privacy. A workbench stood against the left wall exactly where you would put one if you intended to build a life here. Not a junk pile, but a surface with edges you could respect. A magnet strip ran along the pegboard with 3 hooks evenly spaced and empty. Resting hands leave that kind of symmetry. Beside the bench, a low cabinet sat with its handle turned in and a lock the size of a thumbnail winking in the light. The keyhole was a neat mouth closed against a question. I tried the handle anyway. It did not give. The metal was cool under my fingers, not gritty, not neglected. I stepped back and let the flashlight climb. Across the width of the room, 3 tall shapes stood shoulder to shoulder under fitted covers. The fabric was heavy, edged with piping, cut to the curved geometry beneath. Each shape had enough presence to hold its ground, not with bravado, but with the quiet weight of what has been cherished. A single strip of painter's tape clung to the floor before them, a line of pale blue guiding where a careful hand had wanted wheels to stop. If a person needed proof that love can be orderly, it was there at my feet in a straight line. I walked to the first cover and reached for the hem. The fabric whispered as my fingers found the seam. I did not lift. Not yet. It was not fear. It was a kind of respect I had learned too late and did not want to forget again. We rushed toward revelation as if it owes us something. This room did not owe me. It was mine by a sentence and a key, but it had belonged to intention before it belonged to me. The air shifted as I moved, not with cold but with a faint hum I had missed before. Somewhere overhead, a small fan must have turned. The room did not smell like neglect. It smelled like a place held in readiness. A length of clean shop towel had been folded into a square on the workbench. I set the flashlight down so its beam would rest in a cradle of light across the towel. I pressed the center and watched the fabric spring back. It had not been there since the beginning of time. It had been placed with the thought that someone would return and need it. I let myself think his name where the room could hear it. "Richard, what did you build in here?" The syllables did not echo. They landed and were accepted. I stood for a moment with my palms flat on the edge of the bench, the way I used to stand at the kitchen counter when a day had complicated itself beyond solving. In my head, I saw him bending over a line of parts laid out like punctuation marks on a newspaper. He would say a thing did not need to be expensive to be worthy. He would say people love spectacle, but permanence is quiet. The memory threaded through my shoulders and softened them. The flashlight drew my eye to a row of labels on the far wall. They were the kind you print when your handwriting disappoints you. Battery charger, torque wrench, miscellaneous fasteners. The hooks beneath were bare. Absence can be as informative as presence. Someone had cleared tools with care, not dumped them, not stolen them, taken and kept where they would not be lost to chance. Above the labels, a slim duct cut across the wall and disappeared into a box with a green light winking. Climate control. Not lavish, but competent. Another sign that neglect here had been a costume for people outside, not a condition inside. I crossed back to the low cabinet and knelt so my eyes could be level with the lock. There was a tiny scar in the paint where a key had missed on its first try. My ring grazed the edge and made a soft chime more felt than heard. I tried the keys I had one by one, more for ritual than hope. None fit. I smiled a little at the thought that whoever set this place in motion wanted me to arrive on a particular cadence, not leap to the end. The smile surprised me. It did not erase the ache across my chest from yesterday's cruelty, but it sat beside it without apology, like a small warmth placed near a bruise. The flashlight made a narrow aisle of light between the covered shapes. I walked it slowly. The first cover curved at wheel height, where a tire must rest. The second had a sharper profile, a hint of a fin at the rear. The third was lower and longer, a sleeping animal confident in its territory. I reached toward the low one and let my fingers ride the slope beneath the fabric. The material was not dusty. It carried a faint, clean scent, like linen kept in a cedar drawer. Whoever had last touched these had not been in a hurry. I stepped to the side and looked for tire marks. A faint arc of rubber traced a graceful line near the third shape, darker than the floor, not a stain, more like a shadow left by a wheel pivoted with patience. Powdered rust lay in a thin halo at the base of one steel support, a soft bloom that caught the light like pollen. Aged air moved when I exhaled. It was as if time here was a creature that knew how to be still without falling asleep. On the back wall, a vertical cabinet rose taller than I am. It was industrial gray and wore its age without apology. The handle was a long bar set with a keyhole near the top. I pressed the bar to see if a latch would give. It did not. The surface bore small rectangles of lighter color where labels had once lived. I could almost read them in reverse, the way skin reads beneath a ring that has been removed. I imagined a column of categories taken down one day with the same steadiness that put them up. Nothing chaotic here, only choices. I set the flashlight on the floor with the lens angled up so the beam would widen and climb the faces of the covered forms. The light made a soft cone that looked like a meadow at midnight, where fog has settled low. The sight reached something in me that had been starved for reverence. You can spend a lifetime taking care of others and forget what reverence feels like. It is not the same as obedience or fear. It is not even the same as love. It is a willingness to let something be beautiful without rushing to possess it. Caleb's voice tried to enter the room, thin and insistent through the ribbon of memory that ties mothers to their children. No matter what the child has chosen to do, he would tell me to be practical. He would remind me of numbers. He would use the word assets as if it were a replacement for heart. I let his voice pass through like a draft under a door. The room did not have any place for it to settle. If this was a test, then it was not one he was ready to take. I moved toward the back corner where a small stack of cardboard boxes sat neatly aligned. They were new, marked with a supplier's logo and a tiny printed date in the margin. Not boxes that leak and collapse, but the kind that stack and wait without complaint. I touched the edge of the top box and felt the crispness of fresh corrugate. It had not been dragged across a floor. It had been placed. Beneath the stack, a rectangle of the floor was a shade lighter, as if the arrangement had been different last month. The knowledge landed without drama. A person who cared had been here, recently enough for time to remember. I picked up the flashlight again and let it travel along the walls in a slow loop. It found a calendar from 2 years earlier open to June. 3 dates had been circled, no names. The circles were neat and even. A small pencil hung from a string beside it, sharpened to a purposeful point. Above the calendar, a nail held a coil of masking tape. Someone had rewrapped the end, folded it back on itself to make a pull tab. Simple, tender manners with inanimate things tell the truth about a person. If you respect tape, you probably know how to speak gently when anger would be easier. Near the door, a metal plate covered a section of wall the size of a sheet of paper. 4 screws held it in place, the slots all aligned in the same direction, because someone believed even screws should agree about where they were looking. I ran a finger along the bottom edge and felt only smooth paint. No dust line, no film of neglect. I imagined a fuse box or a secret compartment and laughed a little at myself. Life rarely builds secret compartments. It builds habits and places them within reach. That is enough to make a difference. Time rearranged itself without asking. Minutes behaved like a procession of small bowls being set on a table, one after the other, each waiting to be filled. I felt my shoulders drop from my ears and my jaw release. A sentence from the office yesterday tried to climb back into my mouth and failed. The room was not impressed with legal phrasing. It understood only whether hands had been careful and whether minds had come here in peace. I climbed back into the broad light under the fixtures and considered flipping the switch. I waited instead. The little beam was enough for now. I wanted the moment before glow, the one where you still have to choose where to look. I let the flashlight drift toward the first covered form again. When I took the hem between finger and thumb this time, I lifted no more than the width of 2 knuckles. A glint answered. Not a mirror shine, but the honest gleam of metal that has been polished and then allowed to rest. I lowered the fabric, not to deny myself, but to accept the pace the room was asking for. I stepped backward, and my heel clicked against the low cabinet I had tried earlier. The sound reminded me that questions can be set aside without being abandoned. I placed my palm on the top as if a pulse might be there. Silence. Still, I felt less alone than I had all day. Being alone inside kindness is not the same as being alone inside indifference. This space had chosen its side long before I arrived. When the beam reached the far wall again, it paused of its own accord. That is how it felt, as if my hand had nothing to do with it. The light held steady on a square of white that did not belong to paint. At first I thought it was a patch where a calendar had hung and left a ghost. Then the edges resolved. An envelope sat flush against the wall beneath a strip of fresh tape, the flap face down. There was no name on the front, just the patient whiteness of a thing that has endured being looked at without being seen. I did not touch it. Not yet. I let the light rest there and memorized the way the paper held itself. In a world that sells spectacle, paper is still allowed to change a life. I stood with the beam fixed and felt a series of small doors open inside my chest. Whatever this was, it had been placed at a height that matched my eye level. Someone had expected me to stand here and find it without searching. The sound of the alley leaked in around the edges of the door. A delivery truck, a voice calling to another voice, a length of chain being dragged across concrete and then lifted out of the way. The room stayed calm. The beam stayed steady. I whispered a thank you under my breath without deciding who it was for. For Richard. For the stranger who had kept oil in a lock. For the part of me that had walked here instead of begging to remain in a place where my name had been cleaned off the glass. I lifted the flashlight until it pressed a small circle of brightness against the envelope and held it there. Light is an oath if you let it be. The paper gave back nothing except its readiness. I had not found answers. I had found a door to them. In the quiet, I heard the softest echo, like a pen beginning to move across thick paper in a room where people hold their breath. I let that sound guide my next breath, and then I stepped closer, hand open, willing to take what the wall had been keeping for me. His handwriting trembled across the page, but his foresight was steady. I peeled the tape back from the wall with the care you give a bandage that has done its job. The envelope came away clean, no protest, only the soft hiss of adhesive releasing its hold. I felt the weight of paper inside, not heavy, not thin, the kind of weight that says there is more here than a few lines of comfort. I carried it into the small office and shut the door with a gentle click, as if sound itself could bruise what I was about to touch. The lamp on the desk wore a narrow shade the color of old straw. When I turned it on, the room changed temperature without the air moving. The amber of the bulb laid a quiet warmth over the metal of the drawer pulls and turned the grain of the desktop into a river. Where the LED grid in the garage made everything honest, this little lamp made everything tender. I sat, slid a finger under the flap, and drew the pages free. My name appeared first in the familiar loop of his N and the careful slope of the A. The pen had pressed a little harder on the first line, as if he needed to anchor himself before he set sail. I touched the margin and pulled my hand back, then laid it there anyway. He had touched this paper. The fact was simple and unadorned, and it steadied me more than a prayer. He began without apology. He told me that time had been louder in his ears than he let on, and that he had learned to mark it by small things. By how long the kettle took to sing when he filled it only halfway. By how the car hesitated when he turned the key in winter. By how my breath deepened when I fell asleep in the second half of a movie and pretended not to. He wrote that people think a plan is a wall, but a good plan is a window. You can see beyond yourself without having to leave the room. He did not explain the day in Mr. Lowell's office from his point of view, but I could feel it in what he chose to include next. He wrote that the apartment would draw the eye like a mirror draws a hand, and that our son would always be tempted by reflections. He wrote that he had once been a young man who loved bright things, and he had learned how quickly brightness can sour into glare. He wrote that what shines is not always what shelters. The next page brought me to the heart of it. He described a small company born from an old idea. He had a phrase he liked to use when he tinkered at the bench, all those Saturdays when I thought he was merely avoiding errands. He would say, "What if the future has a memory?" Here in ink, he explained what that meant. He had taken the shapes of machines he had loved as a boy and married them to quiet engines and clean storage and the kind of design that meets a person where they live. He had found partners for the parts of the dream that needed other hands. He had built patience into the contracts. He had put every share into a trust that carried my name. I stopped reading and let the lamp glow across the first line of that paragraph until the words took breath. He had not written Nora. "You own this now," as if he were passing a burden wrapped in velvet. He had written that the trust would rest in my keeping because I knew the difference between spectacle and shelter. He had written that I would know when to bring others to the table and when to send them out for a walk so the room could think. He had written that kindness is not softness and that my way of seeing the long line of a day would be the company's spine. If he ever forgets kindness, this place will remind him what love built. He set that sentence on its own as if it were a stone at the edge of a path you must step over to continue. I heard Caleb's voice as it had been at 6, saying I can do it, and then again yesterday, saying I will handle it, as if both sentences spoke from the same mouth, and neither knew the other lived there. The lamp softened the tilt of my reflection in the desk glass. There is a kind of love that stops you from smashing the reflection even when it frightens you. It does not excuse. It does not ruin itself trying to rescue. It holds steady while truth finds a door. He wrote about the garage as if it were a person with tasks. He said it would look tired to strangers and safe to me. He said it would hide what needed hiding while we learned who we were inside loss, and that it would remember where the tools had been when we were ready to take the wall down. He noted the climate system and the wiring, and the way the door had a sweet spot if you lifted from the left. He wrote that he had oiled the lock on the day he realized he was beginning to forget names at the grocery store. He wrote that he could forget the shape of words before he forgot the shape of me. My hands trembled then. Not the frantic tremor of panic, but the undulation of a tide pulling itself from the shore and finding its rhythm again. I pressed my thumb against the margin until a half moon rose in the paper and then released it. The indentation remained. Proof of contact. A small archive of a body meeting a sentence. He went on to speak of people I did not know yet. An advisor who would answer when I called and who would never raise his voice. A technician who understood how to listen to a motor with his palm. A woman who had built her own way through a wall of men in dark suits and who now wrote contracts that breathed. He set their names down and gave me a number for each. He wrote that I should never hurry to dial when fear walked in. Fear rushes. Wisdom breathes through the nose. He did not tear our son in these pages. He did not flatten him into a cautionary tale or a villain. He wrote that love without boundaries is not love. It is appetite. He wrote that a man can grow a soul in the middle of his life if someone teaches him how to be hungry for the right things. He wrote that he had given Caleb what shines to see whether he would learn to use light rather than bask in it. If he learned there would be room at a table I would set. If he did not, the table would still hold. He tucked practical matters between the paragraphs as if they were stones at the edges of a garden path, where the titles were kept, where a combination would open a small safe I had not yet seen, where keys would hang if I looked up instead of down. He included a sentence that made me close my eyes. He wrote that he had routed my future through quiet channels so that shouting could not claim it. The phrasing did not accuse. It tended. He told me one more truth I had not let myself say out loud. He wrote that he had seen our son speak to me with a tone he would not have used in front of a stranger, and that it had turned his stomach. He wrote that a man should never grow so tall that he forgets who lifted him when he could not reach. He wrote that if I needed the courage to say no, I should imagine him leaning back in his chair on a Saturday morning and nodding, the way he always did when I found the sentence a room needed. I folded the first page and slipped it behind the others, and kept reading. He described the origins of the company in a garage much like this one, not ours, a borrowed space with cheap coffee and a radio that could not hold a station. He described the first small design that worked well enough to make grown people grin. He wrote that he had never been so happy to be wrong as when a younger engineer showed him a more elegant solution, and he let go of his version without regret. He wrote that victory feels like wind when you stop insisting it should feel like applause. In the final paragraph, he did what he always did when he wanted to make sure I heard him. He returned to small things. He told me to keep a spare set of reading glasses in the office drawer and a tin of mints in the glove compartment. He told me to keep shoes by the door that I could put on without bending. He told me to drink water before I made any decision that would change the shape of a day. He told me that the world had done its best to convince me I was fragile, and that it had failed. I sat still after the last line, the lamp humming in that soft way that makes a room feel inhabited. Grief did not leave. It rearranged itself to make room for a chair, and another chair, and a table between them where a cup could rest. The pages lay on my lap like a quilt someone had pieced from shirts I loved. I smoothed them without looking down. The old habit of caring for what is cared for you does not leave a woman easily. When I finally folded the pages, I did it along their original crease so the paper would not learn a new habit it did not ask for. The sound of the fold was small and certain. I slipped them back into their sleeve and returned the bundle to the envelope, then slid the envelope beside the lamp. The room felt different now, not because objects had changed, but because I had. The lamp's amber circle rested on the desk like a blessing, trust and love in a bowl of light. I whispered thank you into that circle and let the words sit without decoration. I turned off the lamp and opened the office door. The garage received me with its steady breath. I did not lift any covers. I did not test any locks. I only stood and let the understanding settle where it wanted. The company existed, not as a rumor or an excuse, but as a structure with people and contracts and quiet machines. The shares rested in my keeping, not as an ornament, as a trust. The door to the alley held a thin edge of pale color where morning was beginning its slow arrival. I gathered my tote, slipped the envelope inside, and walked to the big door. When I lowered it to my shoulders, the groove took its weight and carried it to the floor with a gentle seal. I slipped the bar into place and let the pad click home. The sound folded itself into another sound inside my memory, the tidy closure of a folder on Mr. Lowell's desk, transformed now into something that did not hurt. I stood with my back to the door and breathed until the breath felt like mine again. As I stepped into the alley, a breeze lifted the ends of my hair and moved along the brick as if it knew a path. The pages I carried had tilted the world by a degree, not so much that I stumbled. Enough that the horizon looked honest. I heard a scrap of paper skitter along the pavement and settle. The air tasted new, not because of the weather but because of the shape of what I now held. I began to walk. The soft sound of folded paper in my bag became the sound of a sail taking wind. Somewhere, a kettle would be singing soon. Somewhere, the day would require a decision. I let the faint whistle of morning slip into my ears and carry me forward. When I dialed the number he left, a stranger answered like he had been waiting 6 years. There was no hello shaped like a question. There was an intake of breath, and then a voice that had already stepped into the room with me. He said Mrs. Bennett in a way that made my name feel steady. I said yes and told him I had found the pages in the office and that the lamp had made the words warm. He paused as if to honor the lamp and then said my name again, softer, as though confirming a password we both understood. I stood at the small desk with my phone in my hand. It was an old model with a hairline crack that caught the light like a vein of quartz. The battery icon hovered at 3/4. The world outside the door had shifted to daylight. A rectangle of brightness spread across the concrete like a quiet flag. I pressed the edge of the phone to my palm the way I had pressed the key hours earlier. Even objects will meet you halfway when you show them you are not afraid. The man said his name was Archer. He said he had worked with my husband on a long plan that preferred patience to applause. He said nothing that sounded like sales. He did not try to impress me with jargon or drown me in numbers. He began with the shape of things. He said the trust existed, and that it had done its work in silence. He said some procedures would bring it forward now that the time had ripened. He said it would move at my pace, not the pace of a room that confuses urgency with importance. I asked the first question that came. I said, "Did my husband expect me to be alone for this?" Archer answered without flinching. He said your husband expected many things, and he planned for more than he expected. He paused, and the pause told me he was choosing an honest road, even if it was not a smooth one. He said Richard predicted that your son might ask you to leave the home quickly. He said it with the mercy a surgeon uses when he names the thing that is hurting you and then explains how he will remove it. It was a relief and a bruise at once. There is a moment when truth arrives, and you realize you have been correct to feel what you felt. It hurts less and more at the same time. I let my free hand rest on the desk. The lamp was off now, but the shade still held a memory of gold. I asked Archer how long he had been holding this watch with my husband. He told me 6 years ago. He told me that trust was the only thing that could carry a plan for that long without leaking. He told me that Richard had chosen to stack quiet actions one atop another until the structure could stand its own weight. We moved into action before emotion could harden around the words. Archer listed what he needed from me to open the next door. Identification of the simplest kind. A small set of signatures. A visit to his office so he could see my eyes in the same light as my name. He asked if I could come today. I looked at my phone and then at the envelope tucked in my bag and said I could. He said late morning would be best. He said he would email a map and a list. He asked if the garage was secure. I told him the lock turned like a practiced greeting. He said that was my husband's touch. He did not have to tell me what I already knew. Richard had left competence where he could not leave himself. Before we ended the call, he said one more thing, careful, measured, as if placing a cup on a table in a moving car. He said to Mrs. Bennett, "I trusted you." He just did not trust the world around you. The sentence did not accuse anyone. It placed a coat on my shoulders and buttoned it without asking whether I felt the wind. I said I understood, and I did. The call ended with a soft tone. For a second, the silence where his voice had been felt like a chair pushed back from a table after a good conversation. The quiet did not ache. It waited. I stood and put my phone face down. The office had a small mirror with a seam in the silvering at the edge. In it, I saw the woman who had walked out with keys and nothing else. She looked back at me without asking to be rescued. I straightened the strap on my bag and went into the main space. I switched on the overheads. The room lifted its face to the light. Time to move. The words were not a command. They were a door opening. I began with what I could do without anyone's permission. I photographed the positions of the covered forms from 3 angles. I took a picture of the calendar and the coil of tape and the labels along the wall. I took a shot of the low cabinet to mark its state and the tall gray one for the same reason. I opened my tote and slipped the folded shop towel inside, as if I were carrying proof that an order had existed here before me and would exist after me. I slid the envelope deeper in the bag, where it would rest against the inner pocket and not wander. I checked the small office for anything I might need. The kettle was clean. A box of tea waited in the drawer like an invitation I did not yet have time to accept. A notebook lay ready with a pencil set neatly on top. I wrote a date and a single line beneath it. I wrote today the room told me its name. I closed the cover and put it back. You do not need to take everything with you at once. Some things prefer to meet you where they are. When I stepped into the alley, the air had a clear edge to it. The kind of morning that made colors look as though they had been washed and hung on a line. I locked the door and pressed my palm to the metal. The warmth that came back to me was not from the Sunday. It was the heat a place keeps when it has been hosting a story. I walked toward the street where the city moved forward with its usual choreography of deliveries and early lunch prep and children testing their shoelaces against gravity. My phone buzzed as I turned the corner. Caleb. A short message. He said the designer was asking about the wall where the study used to be and needed a decision by the afternoon. He said he could not reach me earlier and that the doorman had my forwarding information if I would only cooperate. He said there were boxes to be dealt with and that Aunt Louise had no space. He added an instruction about my wedding albums without asking if I wanted them. I read the words and felt nothing stick. A few months ago, I would have hurried to backfill every gap he had left in his plan. Today, I typed a line and sent it with both hands calm. I wrote that I am not available this morning. I wrote, please hold my things. I wrote that I will arrange what belongs to me. Then I put the phone away before his reply could push at the door I had just closed. The bus stop at the corner was empty. I chose a cab so I could think without the rhythm of stops and starts. The driver asked where, and I gave him an address Archer had sent. He nodded and drove like a person who has learned how to carry other people's days without spilling them. I watched storefronts slide by. A bakery is placing a chalkboard on the sidewalk, a tailor pinning a suit to a headless form in a window. A woman is tapping a stroller wheel with her foot to make it stop rattling. The city did not care about wills or shares or who had been told to leave. The city cared about getting through its morning without breaking. At a light, my phone buzzed again. Not Caleb this time. Archer's office is confirming the time. A small map. A line that said, please ask for me at reception. The message included a note that parking would be validated. The kindness of that detail felt like the lamp in the office, a practical glow in a place that can often be hard-edged. I sent a simple acknowledgement and put the phone away again. The old device had turned into a tether between a past that had nearly erased me and a future that had remembered my name. The building he directed me to was not glassy or aggressive. It was a brick with a modest portico and a door that had been opened enough times to learn the hinge's soft voice. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon oil. The receptionist had a stack of folders whose edges lined up as neatly as Lowell's papers had done, but the room breathed easier. A bowl of wrapped mints sat near the sign-in tablet. Archer's message had told me to ask for him. I said my name, and the receptionist nodded and lifted a phone with a soft, practiced motion. While she waited for a reply, my mind flicked back to the garage and the way the light had pooled around the envelope on the wall. In an ordinary life, you do not expect paper to lift a roof for you. It had. It had let air in where the ceiling had felt too low to stand up fully. The receptionist set the phone down and told me he would be with me in a moment. She offered water. I asked for none. I did not want a plastic cup to be the thing I held if my hands needed something to do. A door opened down the hall, and a man appeared. He was of middle height and wore a suit that fit because he had chosen it to serve, not to announce. He walked toward me with that slight forward lean of people who have promised to meet you where you are. He did not extend his hand immediately. He waited until our eyes had agreed. Then he greeted me by name as if he had been rehearsing it since the day Richard first signed a document and looked up and said, "This is for her." The meeting would happen next, but first, there was one more piece of business the day asked of me. I took my phone from my bag so I could silence it without fumbling later. The screen lit with the small icon of a missed message. Caleb again. A single line. He wrote, "Do not make this difficult." I did not answer. I pressed the side button. The phone made the soft click of a world going quiet. In the same breath, I heard another sound, the quiet release of a latch as Archer opened a conference room door and held it for me. The two sounds braided together, one ending and one beginning, and I stepped forward toward the table where my husband's patience had been saving me a seat. He placed the folder between us as if it were an altar. The table was a pale oak that drank the morning light without glare, and the folder sat at its center the way a steady heart sits in a chest. The cover was deep green, not glossy, not dull, the kind of color that makes you think of patience. Archer rested his fingertips on either side, as if to keep the room from rushing ahead of itself. He said, "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the work you did just by walking in here." Then he lifted the cover, and the room changed. I noticed small things first, because small things have been saving me. The corners of the pages were rounded, no sharp edges to snag. The tabs were hand-labeled in a clean print that avoided flourish. The first tab reads Structure, the second read Holdings, the third read Governance, the fourth read Contingencies. Archer said your husband asked me to build this so it would hold under pressure. He did not mean the folder, he meant the idea living inside it. He began with a map of relationships that looked almost like a family tree, if a family tree could be taught to behave. He pointed to a trust bearing my name. From that box, a line ran into a company with a plain working title that nonetheless felt like a poem when I said it in my head. Harbor Current Works. Those company lines led to partnerships and licensing agreements, and a small cluster of subsidiaries designed to keep risk where it belonged instead of where panic might put it. Every line had a purpose and a limit. Archer said, "Think of this as a house your husband built. A storm can take a shutter without taking the roof." He turned the page, and the green edge tab revealed numbers that did not add up. Valuations populated a table with the modesty of an accountant who sleeps well. A letter of intent from a partner sat clipped beneath, with the kind of restraint that speaks louder than trumpets. Archer said the portfolio has been measured by external eyes. He said independent audits have been completed each year. He said all filings are current. He said we have no appetite for headlines. I watched his mouth move and heard Richard's voice in the space behind the words. "People love spectacle, Nora, but permanence is quiet." I asked what all of this meant in plain life. Archer said it meant options. It meant the company could grow on purpose rather than by accident. It meant investors would have to meet the standards set in the documents, rather than the documents bending around an investor's appetite. He paused. He looked at me the way a doctor looks when he needs to speak the hard part clearly. He said, "Your husband left your son what shines. He left you what lasts." The sentence found a place to sit in me and made itself comfortable. It did not gloat, it explained. He slid another page forward. It showed an address in tidy type with Unit 11 beside it. He tapped it with one finger. He said, "This is not a sentimental footnote." He said the registered office for the trust and the principal records location for Harbor Current Works are established at this site. He explained that a physical locus with controlled access and climate integrity had been necessary to avoid the entanglements that happen when documents live at addresses tied to other people's egos. He said a storage unit on paper is anonymous and uninteresting to those who hunt for status. He said an uninteresting address can be the best friend a long plan ever had. I thought of the door rolling up and the grid of lights waking the room, and the fresh tape on the wall. I thought of the folded shop towel on the bench and the even line of empty hooks. The details I had noticed now rose together to form a single sentence. This was a deliberate center, not a leftover corner. Archer saw the understanding land and waited for me to breathe through it. He said the valuation as of last quarter exceeded $10 million in current terms before strategic partnerships close. He said that the number did not include the intangible strength of patents and designs that were already drawing inquiries. He did not use the word wealth. He did not need to. The word value hung in the space between us and did not brag. I asked what my obligations were. He smiled in a way that did not sell anything. He said to keep the purpose intact. He said to weigh invitations against the spine of the trust. He said to refuse urgency dressed as opportunity. He said to keep records with the same tenderness you keep photographs. He said to remember that some of the most important decisions are made by the quality of the room before anyone speaks. Then he turned to the governance tab and showed me what Richard had made to hold me steady when storms came. A board existed already, not the kind that crowds with strangers who like their names printed. 3 people only. Archer himself is in a fiduciary role. A woman named Sloane Mercer, whose work drafting agreements had turned more than one predatory bid into a polite exit, and 1 seat is reserved for me. An optional advisory chair waited for a 4th when I felt the time was right to bring someone in, whose presence improved the tone simply by arriving. Archer said some bylaws prevented unilateral decisions when those decisions would pull the spine out of the house. He said your signature matters, but so does the room you bring with you when you sign. We moved through contingencies. If I became ill, the trust appointed a guardian role for governance with an expiration date so that power could not get comfortable. If a shareholder attempted a hostile approach, the clauses around patents and licensing would collapse the ladder they tried to climb. If rumors began, Archer's office would provide the only statements, and those statements would be as boring as possible. He said boring statements are the shelter of living ideas. My phone rested face down at the corner of the table. I did not need to glance at it to know Caleb had probably sent something sharp-edged by now. Archer did not ask to see it. He placed a single page beside the green folder. It was not dramatic. It was simply a schedule. He said, first, we file notices to reflect the trustee now acting in full. Then we update banking relations to reflect the same. Then we open a vault at a legal records facility to mirror what lives in the garage so that nothing is kept in only one place. Then we request a security assessment of the unit to see if any practical improvements should be made without altering its uninteresting face to the world. He said, last we scheduled your visit to meet the operations team on a day when they can see the person their work has been serving. His hands were still as he spoke. They did not jitter with caffeine or impatience. When he finally reached for a pen, it was not the silver one from Mr. Lowell's table. It was blue and functional and warm from being held earlier that morning. He wrote dates the way a gardener writes the timing of a seed. He said these can move if your body asks for rest. He said the plan will not punish you for being human. I asked him what he had thought when Richard first came to him with this idea. He leaned back slightly and looked at a point just past my shoulder, not because he was avoiding me, but because the memory lived on the far wall for a moment. He said, I thought he was building a shelter. Later, I learned he was also building a lesson. I asked what kind of lesson. He said that value is not the glittering part. Value is the part that endures the weather. I told him about the small office in the unit and the lamp that turned the pages into a river of warmth. I told him about the silence that had held me without swallowing me. He listened the way a person listens to a score they have learned to play by ear. When I finished, he nodded. He said that the room has been keeping time for years. He said, your husband asked me once if I believed places could take care of people. He said I told him I believed people could teach places to do so. Then he tapped the page where the registered address was printed and said, this is one of those places. He guided me through signatures that were not performances. The documents acknowledged what already was. They did not force something new. Each page had a line for my name and a line for a witness. The receptionist entered with quiet feet and left with the same. Archer placed each signed page back into the green folder, as if returning a book to a shelf where it knew its neighbors. Nothing clattered, nothing flew. When we finished, he closed the folder and kept his palm on it for a breath. He said, there will be time to decide what you tell your son and when. He said that the decision is not part of this meeting. He said grief is still in the room and will be for a while, and that we will make room for it rather than pretending it has left when the clock hits a certain hour. I felt an exhale unwind inside my ribs. I had not noticed I had been holding that breath for days. He asked if I had any last concerns before we stepped into the practical world. I asked about safety, but that was not a guard at a door but something steadier. He said we would put an unobtrusive camera at the unit for proof of entry and exit. He said we would keep a second copy of certain items in a vault under his office that had survived both storms and budget cuts. He said we would use a rule of 3 for anything that mattered. A place to live, a place to mirror, a place to remember. We stood. The green folder remained on the table just long enough to feel like a candle at the end of a service. Archer picked it up by the spine with the same care he had used to set it down. He slid it into a slim case that had no brand on the outside. He said, let us get these filed, and then we will walk through timelines with my assistant. As he closed the case, the clasp made a sound like a soft agreement. The kind men used to make with a handshake, when a handshake meant something. He opened the conference room door, and the hallway greeted us with its quiet carpet and a line of framed photographs that did not brag. As I stepped out, I heard the brief click of the case closing settle into the soft rhythm of footsteps moving toward the rest of the day. The sounds braided themselves into a single thread. Behind us, the room held the light we had made. Ahead of us, the corridor waited with a door that would open into a life where my name would be allowed to stand up straight. He opened the door wearing confidence like armor. The hallway light slid past his shoulder and caught the slick sheen of a new floor sample, and for a heartbeat, I saw the boy who used to race me to the car with untied shoes. Then the man stepped forward, chin set, and the memory shut its door. He said I took long enough. He said we needed to talk in grown-up terms. He stepped aside for me to enter as if hospitality were a pose he knew how to hold. The room was in its awkward middle. Plastic sheeting hung like pale curtains, masking tape drew temporary borders on the floor, and a ladder leaned against a wall that had changed color 3 times in 2 weeks. A pattern book lay open on the counter like a map of a city he intended to own. I noticed the way his hand rested on it, flat, claiming. I noticed a crystal-framed mirror propped near the hallway, waiting to be hung, catching the fractured light of noon and breaking it into careful pieces across the ceiling. He did not ask me to sit. He started with information and used it like a weapon he had paid good money to sharpen. He said he knew about Harbor Current Works. He said he knew about a trust that did not carry his name. He said a principal records address tied back to a certain unremarkable unit behind a blue door in an alley that did not impress anyone. He said he had reached out to a partner, and the partner had smiled through a sentence about governance and then stopped returning calls. He said his own investors wanted reassurance. He said my silence had made him look like a fool. My hands stayed loose at my sides. I let him empty the bucket of his certainty so I could see what lay at the bottom. He moved closer, and I could smell the ghost of a cologne that he thought was subtle. He said I had humiliated him. He pronounced the word as if it were a verdict only he could render. I felt the sentence land, and then fall short of any place where it could harm. I told him no. I told him he had revealed himself. He blinked like a man not used to having a mirror held at his height. His laugh came out small and sharp, and then he tried on another tone, the bargaining one, the one that used to get him extra time on a school project. He said we could fix this. He said if I would simply acknowledge that I had misunderstood the scope of what I had been given, he could fold the assets into a larger play that would benefit everyone, meaning him, meaning the people who had placed their bets on the shine he promised. He used words like synergy and leverage, as if they would charm a door into opening. I told him the door he wanted did not belong in his hands. I told him the structure was built to last, not to flatter. He said I was reciting slogans from someone else's manual. He said I did not understand how these things worked. He pulled a sheet from a folder and laid it on the counter like a trick card, an organizational chart printed in gray boxes, a cascade of lines that suggested control. He tapped twice on a section he clearly thought was his. He said, "This is where I come in." I studied the paper. It looked almost like the one Archer had shown me, except this version leaned toward arrogance instead of architecture. When I did not move toward the bait, he pivoted again. He said he could contest the arrangements. He said no court would honor a scheme that cut a son out of the center of his father's creation. He said public sympathy would be on his side. He said the optics favored him. He liked that word, optics, as if life were a stage where the light could be adjusted until ugliness softened. I told him the documents were strong. I told him they had been built without romance and without loopholes. I told him he was free to hire any counsel that made him feel taller, but that a suit does not grant a man a spine. He stepped back then, as if the sentence had brushed against something tender under the armor. For a second, I saw how tired he was, the way a man looks when he has tried to bend a weak to his will, and the weak has merely yawned. He reached for a glass of red on the counter, and held it as if it might give him a different ending. He asked if I had intended this. He asked if Richard had meant to shame him by giving him what shines while giving me what lasts. He asked if we had laughed together in that small office over tea while we planned to see him beg. I told him no, again. I told him his father had trusted me to protect what needed protecting and to measure what needed measuring. I told him love without boundaries is appetite. He said I was lecturing. He said I was ungrateful. He said I owed him more than a locked door in an alley and a rule book written by ghosts. Something in his voice cracked around the edges. He lowered the glass before it shook. He said the deal he had been building depended on a clean path into Harbor Current Works. He said he had presented a slide deck to people who admired his timing. He said he had spoken about synergies between old silhouettes and clean drive, and the room had nodded along with him, because rooms do that when a man fills them with a certain surety. He said he could not go back and tell them the gatekeeper was his mother. There are sentences a woman hears that feel like wind passing through a doorframe. They do not move the furniture. He kept saying, I. Each time I lay down next to the last until the floor was crowded and there was no room for us, I waited and let him hear the echo he was making. When he ran out of air, I told him the truth that Richard had put on paper and asked me to carry. I told him the company was meant to endure. I told him it would welcome hands that respected what it was built to do. I told him it would withdraw from hands that needed it to be a mirror. He stepped back into the line of the mirror propped against the hallway. It caught his reflection from hip to shoulder and sent inexact versions of him across the ceiling. He glanced up, distracted by his own fracturing, and his heel met the foot of the ladder where it leaned. The ladder lurched. He grabbed the frame of the mirror to steady himself and pulled it too far. The mirror slid, kissed the floor with a clean sound, and then a hairline crack skated from one corner to the opposite edge, quick and decisive, like a truth finally spoken. He froze. The room moved around the moment, dust motes turning in a current I could not feel. He looked down at the line that had crossed his reflected shoulder and cut his tidy image in two. He whispered something that sounded like a prayer someone might say when they have not practiced praying. Then he set the mirror back against the wall, with a care I had not seen him use that day. He stood straight and worked his jaw as if fitting a new bite. He said, "Do you even understand what you have done to me?" I told him he had done it to himself. I told him he had given strangers a promise his father never made. I told him he had ridden the brightness of a thing without bothering to learn its bones. He stared as if the words had entered by a door he did not know his mind possessed. He lifted the glass again, a reflex, and bumped it against the edge of the pattern book. Red moved across white like a small accident, learning to be a warning. He set the glass down too fast, and it tipped. The wine found the table's edge, gathered itself, and fell to the floor in a soft burst that dotted the plastic sheeting with color. He flinched as if he had been struck. Then he did something I had not expected. He pressed his thumb to the spill and tried to erase what he had called. It only widened and thinned, the way an apology does when it is about optics instead of repair. He straightened and looked at me, and for a moment the armor did not fit him. The room went quiet as a church might when a child realizes he has broken something that mattered. He asked what I wanted, not in the resentful tone he had been using, but in the voice he once used on a curb at 6 years old, asking if he could try again to cross the street by himself. If I had not known the cost of rushing comfort into a space where truth had just found its seat, I would have wrapped him in the old assurances and told him he would be fine and that we would fix it. I did not do that. I told him I wanted respect to return to our family. I told him I wanted him to stop speaking to me like a bureaucrat moving a file he never intended to read. I told him I wanted him to treat the work his father left as work and not as a costume. He said, "What about me?" I said that when your behavior stops requiring other people to pay interest on your choices, there will be room for you at the table. He said, "You think you are the table." I said, "I am not furniture. I am the person whose name the trust carries, because your father believed I would remember what mattered when rooms got loud." He turned and stared at the damaged mirror again as if it were a portrait of a man he had not met. He said, "People will think I failed." I told him people think all kinds of things when they are invited to watch a story from the outside. I told him what they think will not repair a single misstep. He said I should have told him sooner. I said he should have listened sooner. We stood inside that unkind symmetry and breathed. At last, he said, "What now?" The words had no polish. He looked smaller when he said them, not in a way that made me pity him, but in a way that made room for the person he could still become if he chose to learn. I told him now I would go. I told him he would decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the space left behind. I told him that when he was finished shouting at the air, he could call me, and we would speak about boundaries and work and how to move without stepping on the people who kept the floor steady beneath him. He opened his mouth and closed it. He adjusted his cuff as if precision could put the sentence back in order. He looked at the red drying in a crescent on the plastic. He looked at the crack that had crossed his reflection. He asked if I was angry. I said anger had brought me to the door. Clarity would walk me out. He moved, and for the first time since I had arrived, he stepped out of my way not as a performance but as an instinct that had remembered courtesy. I walked toward the entry. I touched nothing on my way. Rooms like this get tired of being pawed by people who think ownership makes them gentle. I reached the threshold and rested my hand on the frame because leaving deserves a marker. "Behind me," he said, "Mother," and stopped. The single word did something to the light. It made it honest. I did not turn. I told him I was listening. He did not continue. The silence had weight. It was a start, but a start does not ask for praise. I picked up my bag. A stemless glass on a side table tilted and surrendered the last of the red to the floor with a soft patter like someone clapping alone in the back row. The sound rose and fell and rose again, and in my head it changed into something else. A long, easy hush of water meeting shore, a tide pulling itself forward and back, teaching anyone who cared to listen how to leave without erasing where they had been. I stepped through, and behind me, one door closed. Once, with the resignation of a room that knows it will be asked to hold far more than furniture. Silence followed me out of that house like smoke leaving a fire. It did not chase. It drifted, thinned, and then let me breathe. On the sidewalk, the air felt honest. A delivery van eased past, A cyclist lifted a hand to thank a driver who had waited at the crosswalk. Somewhere a radio tried to hold a melody and almost managed it. I stood for a moment with my bag on my shoulder and let my pulse slow until it matched the city's steadier rhythm. Anger had brought me in. Clarity walked me out. The first place my feet knew to go was the unit. The alley met me with bright edges and the same good hush that had greeted me the first time. I unlocked the door and rolled it up just enough for my body to slip through. The light inside was waiting without performance. I set the bar and let the door settle behind me with its clean seal. My hand found the switch for the overheads, and the soft grid warmed the room. It was a relief, the way a lamp is a relief in a storm when the power holds. I put my bag on the workbench and stood still. The shapes under their fitted covers held their ground with that quiet confidence I had come to recognize as care. I did not uncover anything. I did not need to prove I had power over what Richard had made. I only wanted to stand where my husband had put intention inside four walls and remember why all this had begun. The office door sat ajar. The lamp waited. I reached into my bag for the envelope and felt the steadiness of the pages inside. They had not changed since morning, but I had, and change is a kind of light that does not ask permission. I did not sit this time. I knelt by the panel in the wall with the 4 screws whose slots had been aligned, as if they were listening in the same direction. I pressed along the bottom edge and then the side. A shallow latch yielded under my thumb with a small, shy sound. The plate swung out on an invisible hinge, and the space behind it revealed a box I had not seen before, only as wide as a book and twice as deep. It was not locked. Richard's brand of mercy learned where locks are needed and where presence would do. Inside, a slim folder lay alone. It was the same green as Archer's. My name rested on a tab written in my husband's careful print. I lifted it and brought it to the workbench. There were 3 items inside. A deed on heavy paper that carried a Monterey address I knew only from weekends long ago. A compact ring of keys on a leather fob pressed with a small wave. A note in Richard's hand, only a few lines, written as if he were leaning against a doorway watching me read. He said, "If you are holding this, you are ready to sleep where the air tastes like salt." He said, "Everything there is in your name." He said it would be small because small is easier to love. He said the garden would need my hands. I did not cry. The body has only so many tears to give in a day. I pressed the fob into my palm and felt the shape of the wave as if it had been waiting for my skin. He planned every ending so I could start again. I said it to the room so the room would hear me and keep my side of the plan. Speech can be a kind of promise when you let the words leave the mouth without flinching. I slid the deed back into the folder and put it into my bag. The keys I kept in my hand. They felt honest. The weight of them was the weight of a door that would open. Before I left, I stood with my hand on the first covered shape. There is power in touching something without claiming it. I thought of the day's argument, and the red spill, and the small, sharp sound of a crack crossing a mirror. I let those images slide off the fabric and fall to the floor, where they would bother no one. I turned off the overheads and left the small office lamp on for a moment, then off, then back on again as if to signal the room, and then let it rest. I rolled the door down to my shoulders and then sealed it to the ground with the pad clicking home. My palm lingered on the metal. Thank you is an easy phrase when you mean it. The street outside looked like early afternoon, even though time had done more work than the light admitted. I reached my modest sedan and sat behind the wheel. It had served me well through hospital visits and grocery runs and 1,000 small errands a life demands. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel and let the quiet claim my spine. Then I did what the pages had asked of me in their steady way. I opened my bag, found the smaller ring among my keys, and touched each tooth until my fingers knew the difference by feel. I thought of the garage and the care tucked into every corner. I thought of the 3 shapes sleeping like patient animals. I thought of the way the low one had curved beneath my hand, and I knew what I wanted for this leaving. Back inside the unit, I moved with intention. I did not rush. I turned on the lights, crossed to the far wall, and studied the small row of numbered hooks I had noticed and ignored before. The hook under a brass charm shaped like a bird held 2 keys taped together. A narrow tag carried Richard's print again, a single word that could have been a model or simply a memory he wanted me to keep. The tape came away clean. I walked to the lowest of the covered forms and found the seam. This time, I lifted the fabric halfway along the body until the door revealed itself, a slim curve polished to a soft gleam. The handle gave under my fingers as though it recognized me. The interior smelled like leather kept out of the sun, like wood polished for the sake of touch alone, like a promise that had taken its time. Saturday. The seat took me in the way an old friend does, no questions, no fuss. I slid the key into the ignition. For a breath, I did not turn it. I put my palm on the wheel and listened to my chest for any argument. None came. I turned the key. The engine woke with a low, clear tone, not loud, not timid, a sound like a bow drawn across a string until the note finds its center. The hum settled in my bones more than in my ears. I let it idle, not because I was unsure, but because honoring a beginning is its own kind of skill. Gauges stirred. A soft light answered. The needle climbed to where a mechanic would like it to be, and stayed. There was a small folded card tucked in the visor. Registration, current. Insurance, current. A service note with initials I did not know, and a date only weeks old. He had prepared not just the idea of freedom, but the paperwork that lets it go forward. I eased the cover back down to the windshield so the body would not be naked in the fluorescent light. Some dignity belongs to machines as much as to people. I pressed the release for the door and rolled a few feet until I could open the big door. The alley greeted me like a corridor care had been swept. I eased into the world the way you ease into a pool, when you stop pretending you do not like the water. Outside, the sun struck the chrome and turned it into a thought of brightness rather than a shout. I let the engine hum settle, and then found the street. The road stretched ahead with the unbothered patience of asphalt laid by people who knew their work mattered even when no one clapped. I kept to the right so the lanes could carry those in a hurry farther ahead. The city eased its grip after a few miles. Buildings lowered their shoulders. Trees began to gossip with the wind. The soundtrack lived under my hands. It was not the roar I had heard from boys who mistake volume for joy. It was a deep contentment that met each gear like a sentence landing on the correct word. I drove past places that belonged to the life I was leaving without letting them catch me by the sleeve. The florist with the chalkboard I had bought birthday roses from. The pharmacy where the clerk always called me ma'am and meant it like a kindness. The corner where Richard used to pause and look at a storefront as if it were a problem he could put right with a socket wrench and a patient afternoon. A life is built of such corners, and there is a respectful way to pass them when you are moving on. You look, you nod, you keep going. When the highway opened, I let the engine stretch. Not in speed, but in steadiness. The needle settled into a comfort between numbers and stayed there as if the car had chosen its own pace, and mine happened to match. The land opened in low brown hills under a sky that carried a few high clouds, like ideas that had not committed yet. Trucks shouldered their weight and went about their business. A family in a second-hand SUV spoke with their hands as if they were teaching each other a dance. The world did not care that my name had been moved from one column to another. It cared that I stayed in my lane and that my blinker spoke when it needed to. An hour slid into itself without anxiety. I thought of Archer's schedule and the way dates had looked like seeds in a gardener's palm. I thought of Richard's note about shoes by the door and water before decisions. I sipped from a bottle at a rest area and watched a dog examine a patch of grass like an art critic. I texted Archer a single line to say I was taking an afternoon for myself and that I would be reachable in the morning. He replied with a line that wished me good road and nothing more. No questions. Real trust does not interrogate. As the signs began to speak of Monterey, my chest did something I could not name in a vocabulary. I had learned too late. It expanded without needing to know what would fill it. I exited where the arrow pointed and followed a neighborhood street that used its curves to slow everyone down to the neighborly speed of being seen. The address on the deed led me to a small house that hid behind natives and a narrow path, weathered shingles. A low roofline that stooped in the friendly way of a person leaning to listen. A gate clicked under my hand like a good memory finding its place. I parked along the curb and turned the key. The engine settled back into its resting breath and then quieted. The silence that followed did not feel like smoke now. It felt like a held note finally resolving. I stayed a moment with my hands still on the wheel. In front of me, the path offered its small invitation. A brass number on a post matched the paper in my bag. The key fob's wave pressed into my palm again without me asking it to. I left my shoes on the floor mat for a few seconds and leaned back. The air tasted faintly of salt and sun-warmed wood. I stepped out and closed the door with the kind of care you use when a door is new to you and you have not yet learned its mood. The yard made no demands. A terracotta pot waited with soil that wanted hands. A narrow bench sat against the side wall under the eave like a sentence set aside to be finished later. I climbed the 2 shallow steps and stood before the front door. The paint carried the suggestion of blue that had spent years watching the sea. I used the smallest of the keys. It turned with that satisfying dedication I had begun to recognize as Richard's signature on things. The entry opened to a room that had already decided to be kind. Light moved across a wood floor and paused at a woven rug as if to rest. Shelves waited without clutter. A kettle lived on the stove as if it had always considered this its destiny. A framed map of the coastline hung above a small writing desk. I set my bag down and stood in the middle with my hands open at my sides, not claiming, not apologizing. The sound I made in that room was the sound of a person arriving. I did not explore as if I were afraid to miss something. I moved as if the house would show me what it wanted to show when it wanted to show it. A bedroom held a quilt stitched in the colors of late afternoon. A window offered a piece of sky I might learn by heart. I returned to the front and opened the back door. The yard gave me a sliver of ocean between cedars. The breeze walked in and touched my forearm like a friend, making sure I had found the right place. I whispered to no one, and to Richard, and to the air at once. He planned every ending so I could start again. The words did not echo. They nested. I stood and let them settle. I touched the edge of the kitchen counter with the flat of my hand for the simple fact of it. A woman takes inventory by touch as much as by sight. This would be enough. Enough is not scarcity. Enough is a room that has learned how to hold you without flattering you. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon had tilted toward the hour that makes colors deepen. I walked to the curb and looked at the car the way you look at an animal that has just carried you over a hard pass and is now chewing quietly, untroubled by glory. I rested a hand along the roof and felt the warmth it had kept for me. I let the key slide back onto the fob and into my pocket. The engine hummed, and the wind shared the same register here. They spoke a language without arguments. I closed my eyes and listened. The faint roar beyond the blocks, the salt on the air, the small tick as the engine cooled and made room for evening. The road had stretched ahead and then yielded me to this threshold. I stood between the sound that had brought me and the sound that would keep me, and I knew the next breath would belong to the sea. The ocean did not comfort me. It listened. I stood at the low fence behind the cottage and let the long hush of water carry the day to a place where it could loosen and breathe. The line of the horizon was clean and calm, as if someone had drawn it with a steady hand. Gulls traced slow arcs above the cedars. The back step had the smoothness that comes from years of feet finding it without looking. I set my palm on the railing and felt the faint lift of a breeze from the cove. It had the taste of salt and sun-warmed wood. For the first time in a very long time, I felt the difference between being watched and being seen. The sea did not judge. It gathered. Inside, the rooms held their peace without effort. The kettle answered the stove with a soft acceptance that made me smile. When it sighed, I poured water over a tea bag in a mug that had a thin blue line around the lip, the sort of quiet pattern you notice only when your hands are honest again. I carried the cup through the little kitchen and into the small room near the back, where a narrow desk waited beneath a framed map. A lavender sprig lay on the sill in a small glass. I pinched it gently to wake its scent. The air changed. Clean, kind. I thought of the way grief can empty a room and how one branch of a plant can ask it to sit down without taking over the conversation. The cottage spoke in the language of detail. A broom leaned near the back door with bristles trimmed level and a loop of twine to tie it when it grew unruly. A quilt lay across the bed in blocks of dust colors and low river blues. The tiniest nails held a row of hooks for keys and dog leashes, even though no dog lived here yet. Nothing shouted. Everything waited. I walked through and touched the edges of the place as if counting the steps back to myself. I had just set my empty cup on the counter when the front gate clicked. Not the sound of a stranger. The click was something someone used to letting themselves in after a respectful knock. I stepped to the door and opened it before the second knock. A woman stood there with hair the color of driftwood and a cardigan that looked like it had been mended on purpose. Her hands held a shallow basket with 2 jars and a wrapped loaf. She did not startle at my face. She saw me. She said I am the neighbor, and her mouth made my name with the ease of someone who had practiced it aloud until it felt like a prayer. Then she gave me her own name and the basket. She told me the larger jar was soup, and the smaller held honey from a friend inland. The loaf was something with citrus in it because the day asked for brightness. I thanked her and stepped back so she could cross the threshold without ceremony. The floor welcomed her steps. That told me everything. She looked around as people do when they are confirming hope. She nodded at the kettle as if it were a person who had held up well. She ran a hand along the back of the chair with the care you use when you are checking if a seam has set. Then she turned to me and smiled from the middle of her face, not the edges. She said he told me you would come when you were ready to breathe again. I felt the sentence loosen the laces around my ribs. I asked how she had known him, and she laughed in a way that made the walls less careful. She said he had been a courteous conspirator. He came here with photographs of my old house so he could choose things that would not fight your eye. He studied thrift stores as if they were museums, and then came back to ask me whether this chair or that lamp would be kinder to mornings. One afternoon he brought 2 kettles and asked me to listen while they boiled, because he said even water had preferences. We picked the one that sighed. I told her that sounded like him, all the way down to letting himself remember what mattered without making a speech about it. She nodded and touched the lavender sprig on the sill. She said we planted that together the week he decided the paint was ready to watch the sea. He hoped you would pinch it to wake the scent. He said you always notice the small, honest things first. I did not know what to do with the way that sentence moved through me, so I poured tea for both of us and let the steam do some of the thinking. We sat at the little table and watched the light slide across the floorboards. She told me her name again, this time with the story that traveled with it, a life nearby with a husband gone before mine and a daughter who wrote letters because distance had demanded patience. She used the word widow without apologizing for it. The word did not flatten the room. It made a place to rest our cups. I told her about the storage unit and the careful lamp and the pages in Richard's hand. I told her about a lock that turned without complaint, and a room that had learned how to hold a plan without bragging. She did not ask me to hurry to the moral. She did not reach for the part of the story that would let her tell one of her own. She told me this house had been choosing small kindnesses since the day Richard first rubbed a speck of sawdust off the counter with his sleeve. She pointed out the bench at the side wall under the eave and said he argued with the carpenter about the height until the carpenter laughed and told him he loved someone who likes to take shoes off without fuss. He said you would want a place for laces and a place for quiet. I carried the basket to the counter and unwrapped the loaf. The scent rose like a memory that has decided to be a friend. Miriam asked if I wanted help opening the kitchen drawer that sometimes stuck. She said Richard had meant to sand the edge but kept changing his mind about whether the stickiness was a flaw or a useful reminder to slow down. We tried it together and laughed when it slid cleanly, as if the house had decided to make its own improvements. I told her I had never liked kitchens that pretend no one eats. She said this one would forgive us if we burned toast. We walked out back and stood by the little strip of garden. Lavender held the border with the dignity of a simple dress that fits. Rosemary near the steps waited for someone to remember how it likes to be used. A clay pot had cracked on one side, but held a small marigold anyway. Miriam bent to pinch a spent bloom and handed me the piece with a smile. She asked if I would mind if she brought over a trowel tomorrow. She said plants notice when a woman puts a bit of herself in the dirt. I told her I would be grateful. She nodded and looked at the thin line of sea between the trees. She said the water out there had helped her learn how to stop arguing with the past. She said it could help me too if I let it listen. We moved around the small yard and made a map with our feet. She told me about the grocery that does not bruise peaches and the librarian who will renew a book twice if you ask without pretense. She told me where the path along the cliff begins and where it turns dusty. She told me the best mornings for fog and the month when the sun learns how to be tender again after showing off too long. I realized while she spoke that my throat had loosened, not because I talked, but because the world around us had agreed not to demand anything right away. When it was time for her to go, she took one step back toward the gate and then returned to press my shoulder with a hand that knew how to bless without making a show of it. She said she lived 2 doors down if I needed the loan of a pan or of a person to stand still. She said nothing about being strong or brave or moving on. She let the hinge of the gate close without haste and left the path quieter than she had found it. The hour turned. I sliced a piece of the loaf and ate it from my fingers over the sink like my father used to do when he did not want to dirty a plate. The honey loosened with a wooden spoon and draped itself on toast. I let the soup wait until evening. In the front room, I opened a small window and listened to how the house received air. It did not creak. It inhaled and then exhaled through the screen, as if it had a chest that knew exactly how much it could take in. Dusk went about its gentle business, and the walls discovered their afternoon colors again. I walked to the bench and untied my shoes. The motion felt unfamiliar and right at the same time. Barefoot on the wood, I learned where the boards held a knot and where they did not. I set a glass of water on the little desk, turned off the main light, and let the lamp make a soft circle where papers and pens would live later when the day asked something of me in writing. Out back, the lavender darkened to the blue of a bruise that has stopped asking for attention. The ocean found its evening tone and sent it across the yard like a neighbor who brings you a song without words. The sky collected a few clouds and taught them how to hold the last of the light. I stood on the step until the boundary between sea and air blurred, and my shoulders remembered how to set themselves down where they belong. I told Richard thank you with my hands curled around the rail. The breeze carried the shape of the words where it wanted. Night did not press. It arrived like a guest who knows the house well. I washed the cup and the knife and put them where my hand would seek them without looking tomorrow. The bed gave as if it had been asked to hold stories before and did not mind adding mine to the stack. When I lay back, the quilt felt like a sentence that ends with kindness. I slept. The morning woke me without an alarm. First light stretched its soft hand over the sill and touched my cheek as if to ask permission. I answered by turning my face toward it. The ocean did what it always does when a day is beginning. It breathed. I heard the rhythm through the open window and turned the sound into the pace of my own chest. Somewhere, a kettle in another home began to sing. Somewhere, a garden waited for a trowel and the press of new hands. The glass at the sill caught the pale shimmer of dawn and returned it to the room. The sun rose a degree, and the lavender woke without speaking. I stood and let the light find the floor in front of me like a promise I was ready to keep. At sunrise, the coffee did not taste like revenge. It tasted like peace. Steam curled into the first light and dissolved, as if even heat wanted to become sky. I stood at the back railing with both hands around the mug and let the ocean set my breathing. The horizon kept its honest line. The lavender beside the steps offered its clean, small blessing. The house waited without hurry. There was no battle to win here, only a day to inhabit. The kettle had sung with that soft, contented note Richard chose, and I had thanked him aloud the way you thank a person who arranged the furniture so you would not stub your toes in the dark. The air held a salt edge. Somewhere, a gull sketched a rough idea of a circle and then let the wind finish it. I sipped. The bitterness had a purpose. The warmth did not argue. The mug left a brief crescent of heat against my palm and then shared it with the morning. Miriam's trowel rested on the bench like a promise we had both made to the dirt. The garden would learn my hand soon enough. In a little while, I would water the rosemary and lift the spent blooms from the marigold, the one insisting on color even with a crack in its pot. But for now, I watched the water move and refused to make it a metaphor. It was water. It breathed. I matched it. The phone lay face down on the table by the door. I had turned off the notifications last night after sending Archer a brief thank you for the steadiness he kept in the world. He replied with a simple line that wished me rest. I left the device where it was, an object among objects. It would serve when I needed it. It would not dictate the pace. I had been learning the word enough. Enough is a room with one good chair and a window that remembers what direction the light loves. Enough is a small loaf of citrus, a jar of honey that pours without drama, a quilt willing to receive a tired body without keeping score. Enough is a trust that does not glitter, and a lock that opens because someone has been faithful with oil. I looked at the sea and decided enough was the only abundance that knows how to stay. The gate clicked. Not the sharp, impatient sound of someone who believes the world must rush to them. A careful click, a breath, a pause. I turned and saw him standing on the path, not yet at the steps. Caleb wore yesterday's suit jacket without the performance it had carried before. His shoulders had lost the angle of a man playing a part. The light touched his face and did not bounce. It entered. He lifted a hand in a small greeting I remembered from school drop-off lines and soccer fields, a motion from before he learned to negotiate with everything. I did not move toward him. I stayed with my coffee in the railing and waited for him to choose his next sentence. He stepped closer as if approaching a shore he had not earned. He said I drove around twice. He said I nearly left. He said he did not have the right words, but he was willing to try with the wrong ones until better ones came. The ocean kept breathing. The lavender did not correct him, neither did I. He came to the bottom step and stopped. His eyes glanced at the mug as if it were an altar I might ask him to approach. I told him he could come up. He climbed one step and then another, each with the hesitation of a man who has learned that forward is not the same as right. He stood beside me and turned to look at the water the way he used to look at the movie screen before he learned how to check his phone without being caught. He said the word mother and let it hang between us like a fragile bridge. I asked if he wanted coffee. He nodded, and the nod brought something old back to his face. In the kitchen, I poured a second cup and placed it on the rail where the sea could see us, making an effort. He wrapped his hands around the warmth and lowered his head. The first words came out unevenly. He said the deal fell apart. He said partners who liked being promised shine did not enjoy hearing about spines. He said someone had used the phrase governance with a tone he had not heard before, and then he realized the tone was respect, and it had not been meant for him. He spoke quickly, as if trying to outrun his own embarrassment. I watched the small muscle near his jaw work, and then smooth. He told me he had gone back to the office after I left and stared at the cracked line in the mirror until the glass turned him into a teacher he had not hired. He said all that brightness was not light, it was glare. He said he had called an investor to make excuses and heard himself perform and felt tired of his own voice. Then he sat down on the floor between ladders and boxes and fell asleep. And when he woke, the room still did not belong to him, and he felt oddly relieved. He looked at me. The wind lifted the edge of his sleeve and set it back down. He said, I finally saw what Dad saw in you. I did not let the sentence run away with him. I did not let it become flattery to purchase absolution. I told him, then maybe you are ready to see yourself. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he had been waiting for permission to do exactly that. When he opened them, they held less performance and more weather. He said he was sorry, not theatrical, not arranged into eloquence. A simple sorry with no commas. He said he was ashamed of the words he had used and the way he had touched my shoulder in Mr. Lowell's office as if I were furniture needing to be moved out of the way. He said he had been speaking to me as if I were a barrier instead of the person who had raised him and taught him what compassion looks like when it pays attention. I let the apology arrive and find a chair. I did not rush to make it comfortable. The sea would not allow that kind of false mercy. He sipped. The heat must have surprised him. He breathed in through his nose the way I taught him to when he skinned a knee at 7 and wanted to scream and scare himself more than the gravel had. He steadied. He asked what he should do. The question did not offend me. It did not delight me either. It simply came from a mouth I knew. I told him not to do anything new for 3 days. I told him to call his contractors and make arrangements that honored their time. I told him to send one message to anyone he had promised a fantasy and replace it with an honest report. I told him to let the rooms breathe before he entered them. He nodded and held the mug carefully so the rim would not leave a brown half-moon on the rail. He asked about the work his father had set in motion. He said he did not want to steal it anymore. He wanted to learn how to stand near it without bending it. He said he had asked himself in the dark if he could be useful without being celebrated, and he had not liked his first answer. He said he was willing to keep asking until he liked the answer less and respected it more. I told him the company had room for men who learned to listen before they asked to lead. I told him there were ways to be small on purpose so that a larger good could grow. I told him Archer would welcome a conversation about shadowing teams and learning how decisions are made when the point is to last, not to dazzle. I told him Sloan would be the first to put a contract in front of him and ask him to read every word out loud if he ever again tried to force a door with charm. He winced and smiled at the same time. It looked good on him. We stood without speaking for a while. The morning glow deepened and put a thin, bright coin on the surface of the water that moved without clinking. Somewhere, a screen door closed 2 houses down, and a piano note drifted the kind of sound that might be a warm-up or a goodbye. Miriam's curtain stirred and fell still. The world held us in a cup. Caleb set his mug on the rail. He asked if he could come back later in the week to help in the garden. He said he did not know anything about lavender, but he could take instructions. I told him plants were patient teachers if you kept your hands gentle. He said he could be that kind of student. He almost reached for my shoulder, and then remembered and turned the motion into a small adjustment of his jacket. I saw the effort and decided that counted as love. He said he would tell his crew to pause. He said he would sell the penthouse when the practical work made it ready, and that he would live more modestly while he learned. He said modestly, and tried it on like a garment he had not worn since boyhood. It fit better than the suit. He took a breath that belonged to him. He said he would call a therapist who would take his pride apart without returning it in a bouquet. He said he would ask Archer for a book list. I nodded. The sea was quiet with a longer hush. He asked if I forgave him. The question fell between us and did not break. I told him forgiveness is not an event. It is a practice. I told him I had begun. I told him he would know I was still practicing on the days I asked for space. He accepted the terms without negotiation. End of not see. Thank you is not a contract, but it behaved like one then. He finished his coffee and looked at the cup as if it had taught him something. He said he would go. He said he did not want to interrupt the day the house and I had planned. He stepped down one step and paused. He looked back at me with the crooked half smile he used to have when he brought me a dandelion he had promoted to flower. He said, "I will see you soon." He walked to the gate and let it close itself with that particular click that belongs to hinges that have been treated kindly. I stood alone again with the coast and the lavender and the empty cup. Peace is not dramatic. It does not demand applause. It lays its hand on your back and waits until your spine remembers the shape it had before fear. I lifted the mug and set it beside his on the rail like two small planets that had finally found their right orbit. Justice did not bang a gavel. It adjusted the light in the room where we were both standing. The piano down the block moved from single notes to a slow pattern, not a song I knew, just chords placed gently so the air could absorb them. The sunlight poured itself over the waves and did not spill. I went inside, rinsed the cups, and left them to dry without scolding the drops they left. When I returned to the railing, the coin of brightness on the water had become a path thin and bright, and entirely unrequired. I did not follow it with my feet. I let my eyes walk it and then return. The morning held. I felt the day choose a tempo I could keep. Across the yard the rosemary waited, and the marigold insisted, and the lavender practiced its own quiet endurance. I closed my eyes and thanked the part of me that had stayed soft long enough to receive this hour. A breeze passed and carried the smallest hint of piano with it, a note that faded as gently as it arrived. I breathed with the sea and love in, and knew that what needed to be said had been said, and what still needed to be lived would meet me one honest step at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.